And now we're moving more towards action in this next section. How do we combine everything to really catalyze ecosystem change? How do you manage systems to do that? And to do that, Susan Schaeffer is coming up to lead us into ecosystem-enabled innovation insights from the neonatal community, which may not be the first place you would think of doing this, but it's an exciting and fascinating story. So Susan, the stage is yours. Pick any 3 out of 5 chairs.
So I'm going to sit in the middle.
You want to sit between us? Okay.
Yeah.
You should mention that it's pediatrics in addition.
Yes.
Yeah, not just neonates.
Okay, Mark, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me back again today after yesterday's panel. It's been a fantastic meeting so far, and we're very excited that you're all here to join us for a discussion about ecosystem-enabled innovation in the neonatal and pediatric communities. As we began to prepare for this session, which began with a focus on the neonatal ecosystem, we uncovered a lot of innovation that's going on across the whole pediatric population. And so we're going to incorporate that into our discussion today. And while most of the initiatives and projects that we've been talking about over the last day and a half now have been driven by a focus on a particular disease, something very different is taking shape in neonatology and pediatrics. The innovation that we're seeing here is being driven by a tremendous need that absolutely cannot be met with traditional development paradigms. And as a result of this, the neonatal and pediatric ecosystems are organizing to catalyze and enable innovation that advances their clinical mission. The members of our panel began working together in the CTSA Consortium's Child Health Oversight Committee some years ago to facilitate child health research throughout the consortium. And today they're carrying forward very different strategic initiatives that are enlisting diverse stakeholder sets to remove barriers to clinical research that's needed to get innovative drugs to babies and to children. Unfortunately, Ed Connor, who was scheduled to be part of our panel, was not able to make it to the conference because of a health issue, and we hope that he's doing well. He was instrumental in helping us prepare for this discussion, and we're very fortunate that our panelists, Bill Smoyer and John Davis, are both actually involved in the initiative that Ed is leading, and so we'll be able to incorporate that into our discussion today. So let me start with some very brief introductions. To my left and your right, Bill Smoyer is the Vice President of Clinical and Translational Research at Nationwide Children's Hospital. And at Nationwide Children's Hospital, he's implemented a Learn from Every Patient pilot program that's designed to systematically improve evidence-based clinical care by ensuring that every patient within the pilot is part of a clinical research program. On my right is John Davis of Tufts Medical Center, and John is the co-director of the International Neonatal Consortium, or INC. INC is a global consortium. It includes physicians and nurses, regulators, pharmaceutical companies, academic researchers, and families to develop tools to enable the study of new treatments for neonates. Bill and John are also going to discuss the Institute for Advanced Clinical Trials for Children, known as IACT for Children, which is a newly formed nonprofit that's creating an infrastructure for clinical study of products to treat children, including child-centered clinical networks, of which Ed Connor is the president, and John and Bill are both on the SAB. So to get started here, actually, I want John, start us off by describing the vision for how clinical care and research should be carried out. And you're going to describe for neonates, but this is equally applicable to the pediatric population as well. So where are we going?
So we really had a distinct vision. We had a dream of where we wanted to go for pediatrics. So we all thought we would start with that dream. So the first is that every neonate admitted to the hospital will enroll in a study protocol to optimize outcomes similar to childhood cancer that's gone from 20% survival to 90% survival in a relatively short time frame. Almost every child is involved in a cancer study. The definitions for our most important outcomes will be the same worldwide. We'll collect standardized data on all neonates, and the databases will be shared, harmonized, and readily searchable. We'll be able to easily examine survival and outcome based on region of the world and adopt everyone's best practices. We'll have established normal laboratory values based on birth weight, gestational age, and postnatal age. All drugs used in neonates will be approved by regulatory organizations for the use. And that means that sufficient safety and efficacy data will exist to support the use in our patients. That doesn't exist right now. Drug formulations will be designed for neonates and children, and any additives that are in the drugs will be safe and not affect efficacy. Regulators, investigators, funding agencies, industry, parent and nursing groups will collaborate to develop the best master protocols with agents that are regulatory ready. High quality and ethical clinical trials will be conducted in multiple countries simultaneously using the same protocol. And it's going to be done by well-qualified investigators with sustainable infrastructure. We have to end the start the study, stop the study, start again, stop again. And we're going to really develop novel therapeutics for neonates and for children. And much like the CTSA program, we're going to do it faster, cheaper, and better. So that sounds easy, right? That's our vision for where we want to go.
Right. So, and it sounds like, you know, these are a set of, you know, the goals are indisputable, but we're very far from there in neonatology and pediatrics today. And I want to talk briefly about, you know, where are we now? And why are we where we are now, and how is that changing? So just to start off, I understand that something like half of the drugs that are used in children and 90% of the treatments that are used in neonates are untested in the populations and or the conditions for which they are used. Why haven't these drugs been adequately studied? What are the barriers to carrying out that research? Start us off, Bill.
So the 50% might be an underestimate. So I would say somewhere between half and 3/4 of all of the drugs that we prescribe in our clinical practice have either not been studied or tried to be studied and not yielded actionable evidence. So we are basically in the business of using drugs off-label. That's what we do for a living. So historically, there have been a lot of concerns about pediatrics. Children are little, they're vulnerable, but there are bigger issues also. Issues such as they represent small populations. They oftentimes have a disproportionate number of rare diseases that they represent. They're hard to study. They require many sites because there are so few patients at any given site. So John and I both share a view in addition to that dream, which is that just because they represent a small market, just because they can't speak for themselves, that's actually not really an acceptable reason for children in our society to not have access to innovative drugs and devices. So one of the things that has evolved over our careers is that we have kind of realized, accepted that in order to be successful as physician scientists for pediatric studies, we also have had to weave into that part of our careers being around advocacy for people that can't speak for themselves.
Right.
I don't know, John, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think that's really on the mark. It's been even more complicated for babies because everyone says, oh, they're so small and they're so cute. We don't want to hurt them. So in actual fact, by not studying the drugs, we're hurting them more, and it's more unethical care than actually doing the studies. And so for many years, despite a lot of different legislative efforts in the US and in Europe especially, we really did make a lot of progress for children. The Best Pharmaceutical for Children Act, PREA, the FDA Safety and Innovation Act. And one of the things that we'll talk about today, we've translated our research into advocacy. And I will tell you that it is the governments and the regulatory agencies that are driving most of the studies in children these days, very different than adults. And so a big part of that is trying to sort out when you have a complicated pregnancy and a small baby. A baby, we go down now to 22 weeks gestation and about 500 grams. And those babies can be exposed to up to 60 drugs during their 4 or 5 month period in the NICU. How do we sort out the pregnancy, the other treatments, all the postnatal treatments when they go home? So people have said, it's too hard. Let's just ignore it and let's not worry about it. And that has just, we've just accepted that, and we've tried to do a variety of things to get around that. But we found that our survival rates, which, you know, neonatology started in Boston with President Kennedy's son dying a month early of prematurity. That started the Eunice Kennedy Schreiber National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. And we've made a lot of progress, and our survival rates are much better, but over the last 10 or 15 years, they've really leveled out. Partly the last drug that got FDA approval for use in premature infants was in 1991. That's pulmonary surfactant, and that was the last drug that made a huge impact on prematurity outcomes. And yet we spend $29 billion a year in the US on prematurity-related issues, and we have no drug development going on to really make a difference.
Right. So, promise, we're going to spend the rest of the session talking about how these guys and their colleagues are working to meet and overcome these challenges. But this is the background that's driving the need for a kind of innovation with an intensity and a speed that we don't see many other places, if any other places. So getting to the good news now. There's clearly been a change in attitude and priorities, as you said, driven by regulators in the government and new laws that in the US mean it's no longer an option to fail to study medical products in babies and in children. These laws include the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act, the Pediatric Research Equity Act, and the FDA Safety and Innovation Act. Collectively, how have these laws improved the environment for clinical development in children and babies? You want to start?
Well, clearly they've had a significant impact. The impediments that I was mentioning before basically have had to be subservient to the law. So it has created kind of it has changed the dynamics. So companies now need to address the issues. And by the way, I should point out that the US is probably a little bit behind Europe with regard to this and the rigor with which they're approaching it. But there is much more interest, and there has been much more success. John can comment in some more detail about some of the successes. But as we have engaged, there have been some very good successes in getting drugs studied. There are still major challenges in getting drugs studied successfully. And the most recent data I've seen is that something on the order of 30% of pediatric trials don't enroll a patient. So that's not a problem with enrollment or that the patients aren't there. That's a problem with design. So these laws have created this push to do this, and there are people like John and me that are trying to advocate and help our community step up and develop our competence and our capacity more broadly to be able to do this. But these changes have kind of precipitated changes in our community. We have to react to those as well, because now people are coming to us saying, we want help with the study design. We don't know where to find the patients. What? You need 50 sites to do this trial? I mean, that's a little bit different than some of the other patient populations. So, John, I know you've have more experience with some of the successes in studies.
Yeah, I think the legislation really has made a difference in children in general. There's been over 500 new labeling changes, and many of your companies have been engaged in doing these studies in children, but only 28 in neonates, and out of those 28, we only use 7 of the drugs. So out of all the legislation, 7 drugs have had labeling changes in the last 10 years. A big part of the problem is a lot of these drugs are off patent. And there's just no financial model for getting companies to do those studies in children. And so through the BPCA, we actually have a way that if FDA can give you a written request, ask you to do this study, and if you're not interested, they can forward it to the NIH, where there's a contract mechanism out to do a lot of these studies. So we're making small inroads that way through that mechanism to try to make an impact. But it just hasn't affected the newborns as much. And so that's where we really pushed hard on Congress to say, despite all this legislation, and it was a big deal in 2012 to make the legislation permanent, because I think a lot of companies kept saying, well, let's wait 5 years and see if Congress really has the mettle to reapprove this again. And when it was made permanent, people said, okay, well, now the legislation says every new drug that's tested in adults in the United States at the end of phase 2 has to have a pediatric plan associated with it. In Europe, it's actually at the end of phase 1. So that's great that every new adult drug, if there is an indication for children, it has to be studied. What isn't there yet is how about the drugs you're developing just for our population? And again, that's the priority that we're trying to push. And again, we're trying to introduce legislation to try to work on innovative ways of doing that. But as Gigi mentioned in her opening comments, there aren't a lot of people looking to give extra incentives to pharmaceutical companies these days, even though it's really important for us for children.
So we have now a requirement that these studies be done. But these studies are very difficult to do. We've mentioned some of the reasons already, the rarity, the scarcity of patients, the need to enroll large sites. But we haven't talked yet about how you even figure out what to measure in these populations, which in many cases, it simply can't be the same thing that we measure in adult populations. We're lacking. We have many companies now who need to run these trials, and we don't have the tools to do it yet. So let's get into the solutions, because you're each working in different ways on enabling solutions through the community. How is the Neonatal Consortium, how is INC approaching this? What have you done, and how are you going about it?
So this consortium was actually driven by the regulations. And the FDA gave a grant to the Critical Path Institute, which is, many people have worked with that group. They're, quote, neutral third-party conveners. And the FDA had said that we were their 12th consortium that they're running. And they approached it, if there's a need that's an unmet need, what can we do to help that move forward? So the FDA actually, because FDASIA required more neonatal studies, they gave a grant to the Critical Path Institute, who approached many of us to say, okay, how do we make this work for all of neonatology, and how do we do it on a global basis? So it's actually been one of the most exciting success stories in my entire career, is that we set up an infrastructure, and in about 2.5 years, we now have 77 academic institutions in 45 countries. We have over 300 members now. Most of the companies that are represented here are part of our consortium as well. And it's being driven by the regulators. It's absolutely fascinating how the barriers have been broken down at EMA, at FDA. When we have meetings at those organizations every year, we've had a lot of people from Health Canada join, the PMDA, and people have all come together and said, okay, how do we address these outcome measures? So we sit in a room together and we say, okay, how does this work? We pick a specific disease process that's important, and we have 7 or 8 working groups. And each working group has people from industry, families, academic physicians, regulators on it. And it's fascinating because we don't deal with any one specific product. So we stay away from that. That allows the regulators to be full participants, even though the regulators are sitting in a room where a year from now they may be approving your drug. But what we do is we all seem to agree on the same outcome measures, and then we publish it as a white paper. So we did a white paper in a clinical pharmacology group that was everything you need to know about doing a clinical trial in a neonate. Published it, and it's now being used for guidance by every regulatory agency in the world to issue their guidance on how you should do these studies. So we're making progress on things like, well, we don't have enough patients, so we just wrote a paper that has gotten tens of thousands of hits already on how do you co-enroll a patient in more than one trial at a time. We are approaching all the innovative sort of ways of doing it, and we're doing it with these white papers. And think of the time if we can get protocols done in multiple countries simultaneously with the same protocol, the same outcome measures, and then every country gives approval to the drug at the end of the study at the same time. So that's really where we're heading. It's been a fascinating ride. It continues to grow, and more people seem to be getting engaged in the process. But it really starts with the regulators saying, okay, I think we can live with these outcome measures. And think of, for industry, it's a real advantage, because if you've got a product that you're working on, you could work on that protocol. And Bill and I published a paper in Science where for a one-year period, we took 25 protocols for industry, looked at them, found that 6 of them were completely undoable. 6 more, we sent the companies back to the FDA, who allowed changes because we thought the changes needed to be made, not the company. So by getting everybody engaged in the process, then a company can work on a protocol. We can help you develop those endpoints and outcome measures for your protocols. And if the FDA says, yeah, that's reasonable, you've just saved yourself a year or 2 of waiting and going to Health Canada or FDA or EMA, where they say, no, we don't like that. Go back to the drawing board. All of that is already done. So that's the part that we're really the most excited about, and that it's happened so quickly. But that's only because, again, the regulators have bought in, so that you have a seizure brain injury working group with the regulators that are actually going to approve that drug in that agency to say, we want to help you develop the right outcome measures for this clinical trial.
And John, can you just quickly give us an example of an indication with an endpoint that is understood in adults, it doesn't work for neonates, and how INC is figuring out what to do about that?
Yeah, so a perfect one is blood pressure. You have a baby who weighs 500 grams. I'm not sure I know what a normal blood pressure is. What's normal about someone who's 22 weeks gestation? And so when I go to the FDA, EMA, they say to me, blood pressure, that sounds important. Isn't that a vital sign? Vital sounds important. Well, what's the normal blood pressure for a baby? And I say, I'm not really sure. I said, it's kind of like the Supreme Court decision on pornography. I don't know how to define it, but I know it when I'll see it. And it's the same thing. I can look at a baby and say, oh, that baby doesn't look good. But I'm not sure that that number necessarily reflects it. So the first thing we did is we got experts on hemodynamics from all over the world, and we're doing a major literature search and then helping to plan the grassroots studies that will help us define exactly what blood pressure, how do you measure it, how do you validate those measurements, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just one example out of each of the things. You can't run before you learn to stand. And so we're going back to the basics. Things like laboratory measurements. You know, how can you file an AE or an SAE if I don't even know what the normal lab values for a baby is? So Bill's helping me with all the kidney measurements because he's a renal specialist. We're getting other people who are specialized in that area to say, okay, well, let's look at this. Let's look at the databases, and we really are. We've identified 85 databases with over 3 million newborns that are owned by a variety of different people. And again, how we get all those databases together, but we're working on common data elements. So why aren't people in Germany and in France recording the same data we're recording in Canada the same way? So we're talking about CDISC standards and how do we best approach those kind of things so we can look at all the data collectively.
Great. And in a minute or two, I'll come back to you about how IACT is going to take some of these tools and help implement them.
Yeah.
But first, Bill, I want to talk about the pilot program that you've implemented at Nationwide Children's, because it speaks directly to a topic that's come up several times today already about integrating clinical care and research. The pilot program that you've implemented is using electronic health records.
Yes, it is. So several years ago, as part of my role for a title that I didn't understand when I took the job of Vice President for Clinical and Translational Research, they said, so integrate research and clinical care here. So I went and interviewed most of the clinical and research leaders around our organization and came back from that experience with the sobering realization that adding research onto our clinical care could work, but that would be a strategy that would be used by the organizations that would become followers, not the ones that would become leaders. So what I did instead was turn back to, I have an engineering background, and I came up with kind of a systems engineering approach to actually envision that every single child that we provided care, we would collect research caliber data on as part of billable routine clinical care. So we don't have time to go into all of the details of the trial, but we basically implemented this pilot program in one clinical program at one institution where we integrated evidence-based, evidence and expert opinion-based care with evidence-generating care. And we then followed them for 12 months, and we used as outcome measures, how did that change their healthcare utilization, and how did that correlate to changes in total health system costs? So it turns out one of the things that was particularly helpful, and we'll come back to this one of the lessons that we learned from this, was that to engage the physicians in this process, we didn't just collect data as discrete data elements in the EHR. We actually added in research data and embedded it into the EHR so that it all looked the same. But the research data that we embedded was the data that we would collect to answer the doctor's questions about how they could improve the care of their own patients. Not my questions, their questions. So all of these data got collected systematically as part of routine care. And long story short, at the end of this, it was interesting to see that, in fact, this standardized approach with careful monitoring of the data actually reduced hospitalizations by like 43%, or total hospital days by 43%, hospitalizations by 27%, ER visits and urgent care by 30%. And all of that correlated to reduced healthcare expenditures around 25%. So that kind of, looking back on that, what that gave us hope for is that, in fact, it is feasible to kind of implement at least the key components of a learning health system in a large, complicated medical system, and that, in fact, learning systems like that, at least a local learning system, can actually improve care and reduce costs at the same time. Because what I did not mention is that We gave those doctors the data back, and they have data for 4 or 5 manuscripts, and one of them has already driven an evidence-based change in the care that every child at our institution gets now. So that completes the circle that we provided care, the care provided generated the evidence that was used to change the care for everyone else. So I think there are a couple of lessons that we learned in there that I'll just share with you, and they might be sources for debate in this group. One of them that I learned in spades from actually implementing this is that all of our aspirations for realizing the benefits of a learning health system are not going to happen without the doctors. And I think this came up in someone's point yesterday morning when they said, well, what about the real-time clinicians who haven't been trained in research, they don't know how to do it, and they certainly don't want you to slow them down. So in my opinion, this is not going to work if we do it to the doctors. It's unlikely to work if we do it with the doctors. I've come to believe that the winning strategy here for the learning health system is the future is going to be people who come up with a way to do it for the doctors. The doctors will need to be not just tolerant of this, they will need to want the same outcome. So we got lucky in ours by giving them data they asked for, and they used it to improve care. So this is all about aligning interests. So the one other lesson that we learned that is related to that is that while there are technological challenges to implementing, at least from my experience, this local form of a learning health system, the technology is not the limitation. So in my experience, the technology is all there. The barrier is the change in culture. And I would say that the doctors represent both the greatest hope and the greatest barrier. So they must understand how this is going to improve their delivery of care and the care of their patients, preferably both. And when we find that solution to align those interests, I think we can realize these benefits. So when we have time at the end, there may be different opinions. I'd welcome a discussion around that, but this is what I learned from actually implementing it with a group of doctors.
So very different approaches, but all working toward that vision, the dream laid out at the beginning. And I want to talk about what's going to happen moving forward and start that discussion with talking about how IACT is going to help enable and carry forward and use some of these tools and these learnings from these kinds of projects. And after that, I'll invite the audience to ask some questions. But let's talk about IACT. IACT was launched this year. It's a new nonprofit with a mission to create a sustainable infrastructure for pediatric product development. What's the idea here? How can this networked systems-based approach get more trials done and done better for children?
Yeah, I think this was another exciting initiative that we've done, setting up the first global nonprofit pharmaceutical and device enterprise centered on neonates and children. And so the goal is with organizations like Inc. that are developing the tools to help facilitate the clinical trials, I think IACT will take it to the next step, which is actually help you develop your protocols and get the scientific expertise that you need to do the protocols, and then to actually function and get the sites and conduct those protocols. And so ultimately, our dream for IACT is that they will help set up training programs at individual sites. We hope to have approximately 250 sites in about 40 different countries to be able to run clinical trials. Again, master protocols, regulatory ready, so that you have a study on one diabetes drug, and we've talked about maybe the role of platform trials, but do you have one diabetes drug, and again, if the drug works or doesn't work, the day that trial is over, 2 days later, the next diabetes trial starts with the same group of investigators, and it sort of keeps moving along. So we thought that was important. Working with a variety of other networks You know, the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development has 70 networks that they're supporting. That is highly inefficient and really not a good way of doing it. And many of them are set up as disease process networks, and we're trying to look at the big picture. And so we're going to be working with and incorporating and integrating other networks into IACT. Certainly, and the most importantly, I think, is IMI2 and the networks and the initiatives that are going on in Europe. And Mark Turner, who works very closely with us, is a director of INC with me. He's the European director, I'm the US director, and I think both of us will work together to try to integrate all these processes. So I think it's the strategy, the leadership. IACT is fascinating that it's funded by a grant from the Food and Drug Administration, plus it's being funded by the pharmaceutical industries, saying we need a place to go. Because it's really not good to do it individually by each of your companies. You can't hire enough pediatrics people, and the companies are doing that, but you don't have the expertise within any one company to design these trials. I don't have the expertise anymore. It's really that team science approach that you need, having all the key stakeholders engaged in the process.
And this idea of expertise is something that came up quite a bit in our discussions as we prepared for this. And Bill, I think you brought it up, this need to build capacity.
Yes, so this is part of why we are so excited about IACT. Is one of its missions is going to be to help our community learn better how to engage competently in this so that we don't have so many trials that fail. We all are interested in the same goal. We all share that same dream. Our hope is that this will be a sustainable resource to help educate our people more broadly and give them more experience to do this. So this is one of the downstream kind of unmet needs created by the regulations, is now we have to come up with new ways to meet the demands for that. So, we are very excited about the opportunity that it offers for the community, whether it is doing trials for regulatory approval or even trials for academicians, or, as John alluded to, another thing that we could really use improvement with is some standardization of the many registries that we have, which don't even all use the same definition. So one point I should bring forward that came out in our discussions is the last time we checked, just as far as having a standardization and harmonization of data, is there were 9 definitions of what it means to be a child. So what is a pediatric study? So, I mean, the bar is low, so we have much work to do.
So I'd like to invite the audience to ask questions at this point. And after audience questions, I'm going to warn my panelists here, I'm going to come back to you with one more question about, and I'm only going to give you a chance to give me one answer, what needs to happen next to keep this all moving forward. But first, question from our audience.
It's more of a comment. So I fully agree first that we do need more infrastructure focused on pediatrics. At the same time, because of the way that the regulations and the general framework are placed in the US and Europe, where there's mandatory components, there's more voluntary, and some of it does have to do with these judgments about where's the role of any individual drug or program in adults or peds or both or only in one or the other. One of the intriguing things that, it's not my idea, it was actually promulgated sort of incidentally in a paper in New England Journal or Perspective from the oncology folks at FDA, is kind of, instead of just thinking about this in a binary way, the adult studies are here, pediatric studies are here, 2 points. One, there are some situations, maybe it looks like at face value mainly in oncology, but I would urge looking at other disease areas, where the mechanism of action and the disease setting are common enough that, for example, teenagers, young adults, and adults can be included in the same studies, whether they're classic studies or platform studies. There's another piece where even in situations where they're different enough, that the investigation of the key questions in the neonatal or younger children does have to be, unique for all the reasons you both talked about. It doesn't have to be binary there either, in the sense that where the platform, I think, could come in too, is not just a platform, master protocol and platform trials in different pediatric populations, right? It could even be sometimes a platform trial that actually has in it some cohorts that are focused on, adults, and some cohorts that are focused on children. Now, I recognize that that really requires a lot of crosstalk between the docs and the others who, really have to push this, that are dealing with both sides of the equation. But we already have some, again, lessons from that. For example, in oncology, you mentioned the successes. Part of that success, I think, is because there has been some efficiency from having really one network in the US, which is the Children's Oncology Group, which, although it's part of the NCI paradigm for funding as a cooperative group, has really been something that in industry we've worked with. So in industry, when we develop drugs for pediatric cancer, whether it's exclusively for that or for both adult and childhood cancers, we work with the COG in a holistic way. Sometimes we do studies that are, mainly driven by industry, both in the funding and in the design. And sometimes we actually work with the COG on the design of studies that, in whole or in part, are asking general outcomes questions, as you mentioned, and or some regulatory element related to BPC or PRIA. So for all these reasons, I would, again, sorry for the pun, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but think about, are there some niche areas where the platform could be used to answer both adult and pediatric questions?
We're so far behind that we all recognize that we can't do a randomized control trial for every drug in children. There just aren't enough, and none of us will be alive to see them come to fruition. So we're really interested in innovative approaches. Part of the reason why Gigi and I have bonded over this is because really what's happening today is what we all need. I mean, this needs to be the standard, not anything unusual. And so we need your input. We need the input from the regulators and from industry to say, what can we do? Now, FDA has been better about allowing extrapolation, for instance, so there's some component of that. But we really do need innovative trial designs, and I love the concept that a platform could have one, arm for children, and maybe there's only one control group for everybody. And so I think there's a variety of ways we could approach it, but I certainly agree with you 100% that the status quo just isn't going to work. It's not going to work for you or for us.
Well, again, in this space, it may not even need a randomization component to be a platform, right? If it's a basket or an umbrella, that doesn't necessarily mean that it includes randomization if it's just part of the learning. And not necessarily just the end in of itself. So don't always box yourself into the randomization. At least oncologists are used to not doing that. So maybe others need to think of that, especially in the rare diseases.
Yeah, part of the problem in babies, at least, is, I have a trial of 88 babies looking at a pulmonary drug, and I think we had 110 serious adverse events. And that's partly because it's just such a high-risk population as it is. So we recognize that. The other challenging thing with children is the follow-up phase. And so, how do we plan that? And we need help from the regulators to say, well, how far do we need to go to sort out, how do we tease out that one drug that you're giving that child in the NICU? And then do you follow them out just till they go home? Do you follow them out till about a couple of years of age when they first start to babble and things and walk, and is that okay? Do you wait to school and language at 5 years of age? Some people are waiting till adolescence and high school. I mean, clearly that's not feasible for any of us. So, how do we do that, and how do we do the adequate follow-up? Because if you're an adult with an MI, you get a drug for your heart attack, a month later, you put it on a treadmill, you do a 6-minute walk test, boom, boom, you're approved if it works. Now, it's not quite that simple, but, for neonates, that's part of what scares everybody away is, I'm not waiting till these kids grow up to figure out whether this drug was safe or even potentially harmful.
So I want to have time for one more question here, and we'll need to be sharp with our questions and our answers so we can get to our forward-looking what needs to happen.
Are there specific challenges for representativeness of population diversity or inclusiveness in the platforms that you've developed, both at the population level and maybe the community care setting level?
You want to start?
I didn't, what was the question?
I was wondering, are there specific challenges, particular challenges you face in building the platform to get a representative population, that covers the
For sure,
diversity?
there are challenges. So many of them we've already kind of covered, which is that rare diseases are common in our community, and finding sufficient numbers of patients, much less trying to standardize across various subsets, is particularly challenging. Many, I think 40% of trials overall in children fail, and more than half of them at least stall, just trying to get patients in, not even with stratification. So those are challenges that we aspire to have the capacity and the competence to try and address, I would say.
Yeah, and I'd reinforce that. I think getting enough patients is complicated. Getting enough qualified investigators to conduct the studies is a problem. I'm one of the young'uns in this field now, which is scary. But I think, how do we train our young investigators when every year I'm seeing more patients and getting paid less? Because the reimbursement rates, especially, we deal a lot with Medicaid, and they've dropped significantly. So how do I take someone that I want to give 70% protected time to do research, and how do I pay them? And so, in the old days, I could get 50% of their salary under a grant. Now it's a capitated cost per patient. How do I get enough money, unless they do 6 or 8 or 10 trials, especially when you're dealing with rare diseases that we may only see 4 or 5 patients a year? Great, I'm getting $3,000 or $4,000 a patient, but that's not enough to even cover one investigator's half-time salary to actually conduct the studies. So we've got so many challenges on a variety of ways. I'd say patients, I'd say workforce. I think getting the regulators talking and agreeing among the different countries is a really big deal. I think we've made a real start with that, and that's helping. I think those are all the ways we're going to make this work.
So just to wrap up, because we're actually out of time, very, very quickly, that's a long list of things that still needs to happen, but what's, if you had to say, what's the top priority for what needs to happen now to carry this momentum forward and get to this solution of every child being studied, products being approved for their intended uses? What's first on your priority list?
I think the number one thing is getting the regulatory agencies working together globally, and I know that's happening a lot more with monthly conference calls with the pediatric folks at FDA and EMA, and I'm told that sometimes there's 30 different countries on the phone at the same time. I think if the regulators can agree on protocols and outcome measures and the way we design it, then we really can do the studies in multiple countries simultaneously. And I can't understate enough the impact that having the regulators in the room, and because I can't get the people at NIH in the room. They think it's a conflict of interest, but the other parts of the Department of Health and Human Services say it isn't.
So John says regulatory harmonization. What's your top priority?
The complementary priority would be that we then need to increase our capacity to do these studies and our competence. And right now, the reason we're so excited about IACT is this is an organization which has been created by multiple stakeholders with that mission.
Great. I want to thank you both. I encourage everyone to come and talk to John and Bill about their initiatives during the breaks. There's so much more to these than we could have done an hour on each one of them, and they're really fascinating, and the progress they've made is incredible. So thank you very much, and thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to Susan for doing a masterful job again on her second one of moving it through. So thank you, Susan.